Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to look at Chapter 2, Choice in a World of Scarcity. And this is a nice chapter because it's a really gentle introduction into sort of the sense of what economics is, what economists do, how economists try to really answer questions. It's going to give you some of these basic concepts like opportunity cost that you're going to see come up over and over again throughout the course. It's going to have some new terminology and give us some really great models like the production possibilities frontier and the budget constraint, which are really useful and actually I think help us understand a lot of our day-to-day decision making. Not all economic models have tons of day-to-day examples or tons of day-to-day applications, but these ones do. There will be a good amount of terminology in this chapter, different kinds of efficiency like allocative and productive efficiency, opportunity cost, opportunity set. We're going to talk about the difference between normative statements and positive statements. We'll talk about comparative advantage, budget constraints, the invisible hand, Adam Smith's idea that we can organize ourselves through self-interest, the production possibilities frontier model, budget constraint, the idea of sunk costs, which is a really interesting economic concept, the idea of utility, which is just the joy or the benefit or the value we get from everything that we do and buy and see, the laws of diminishing returns and diminishing marginal utility, and this idea of marginal analysis in general, which is really important to economics because we are constantly making marginal analyses. We don't necessarily look at the whole picture, we look at each incremental change, every unit on the margin. And so that's what we'll be taking a look at. So grab your slides, grab your textbook, grab your notes, and let's get started. Okay. So here we are, Choice in a World of Scarcity. And these slides are based on the 3rd edition Principles of Macroeconomics, but the 2nd edition works just as well. And if you've taken microeconomics, then this will be a review for you. If you go on to take microeconomics, you'll see that a lot of textbooks have the same material in the first 3 chapters in micro and macro. So there's a little bit of a review, but that's okay because these are really the most important concepts. And so what we'll be looking at in this chapter is first how individuals make choices, and we'll do that through the lens of the budget constraint, which is just saying the reality that we all want lots of stuff, but we're constrained by what we can afford. And so we'll look at a mathematical and a graphical depiction of how that works. Then we'll talk about the production possibilities frontier, or the PPF, which is very similar to a budget constraint, but basically looks at a graphical representation and a modeling of opportunity cost and looking at social choices and governmental choices and how we can use the PPF to actually model a lot of different things, everything from opportunity cost to trade to comparative advantage. And then we'll talk about the confronting objections to the economic approach, basically talking about how economists view the world and how economists as social scientists try to map human behavior and the different perspectives on that. So when we think about choices and trade-offs, economists try to take a very big view. We don't just consider income and costs that are explicitly laid out. We also consider other trade-offs and choices. So think about the decision to pursue higher education, right? You're all in this class, maybe you're just taking it for fun, maybe you're pursuing your AA, or you're hoping to transfer to a 4-year, or you're squeezing in some extra credits on the side. Either way, you've made this choice, and there's 2 kinds of costs associated with this class and with lots of decisions. There are explicit costs and there are implicit costs, and you know that, right? It's not just that it costs money to take a class, buy a textbook, or buy a computer to study on or something like that. It's also that it costs your time. And the time you're spending here, you can't spend somewhere else. That's why a lot of people pick online classes so you can work full-time and you don't have to give it up. But that choice, that trade-off, is part of the cost that economists consider. They consider the things you have to give up that might not be monetary in addition to the monetary costs of things. And we think of that a lot in terms of the opportunity cost of time or the time you give up. And that's some of what we'll be talking about today. So let's talk about that. We're going to start by looking at the individual choice or the individual perspective, and that's usually easier for folks because then you can think about it from your own perspective. And so we'll talk about the budget constraint first. And so you know what a budget is. A budget is the money you have that you spend on things. It's your limitations on what you can purchase and consume. The budget constraint is just a graphical representation of that. It's all the possible combinations of goods that someone can afford given the price of the goods and all the income spent. And it's going to be the boundary of their opportunity set. And their opportunity set is just all the possible combinations that a person can consume. And so what we'll be looking at in this example is we'll be talking about, and there's a lot of examples in the book and in the slides, but the idea in XY space, right? So we're going to have an XY axis here, that you have a set budget and you're going to spend all your money on two goods. And so maybe you have a budget of $1,000 and you can buy food or stuff. And food costs $2 and stuff costs $5. Your budget constraint is going to be the absolute maximum that you can spend, that $1,000 spent on either of these two things, and the opportunity set is going to be every combination beneath it. So given the price of two goods and a budget amount, a budget constraint can be illustrated graphically. You have a limited amount of income to spend on things, and so you have to make a choice. So if you wanted to spend all your money on food, food costs $2 each. So that means that if you spend $1,000 on food, you could buy, let's put it up here, 500 food at $2 each. Or if you wanted to spend all of your $1,000 on stuff, you could do that too, right? If you spent $1,000 on stuff and stuff costs $5 each, then you'll have a total of $200 or 200 units of stuff. And so this is your budget constraint. And beneath your budget constraint, in here, is your opportunity set. And you can consume any point along this. You can spend half of your money on food and get 250 food, and half of your money on stuff and get 100 stuff, or any other combination. And that's why economists like these graphical representations. On this budget constraint, any one of these points is possible. And that's that marginal analysis I warned you would be coming up. Because we could be here, or we could be here, or we could be here. We could be anywhere on that budget constraint. And that's the way it actually works in real life, right? You spend your money on different combinations of things. You get to the end of a pay period and you think, wow, should I get one more tank of gas? Or should I go get groceries? How am I going to spend my additional dollars? And that's what we represent with this budget constraint. So here's the example from the textbook, and this is saying you can spend your money on either burgers or bus tickets. And let's say you have $10 a day. This is our person, Alfonso, could spend $10 a day on burgers or bus tickets. A bus ticket costs 50 cents. So with $10, he can buy 20 50-cent bus tickets, or he can buy 5 $2 burgers. Every time, if Alfonso starts here at point A, every time he buys one fewer burgers, going from 5 burgers to 4 burgers, he frees up money to buy more bus tickets. Now he can buy 4 bus tickets. Every time he gives up another burger, if he gives up another burger and goes down to 3, then he can buy 8 more bus tickets. So giving up 1 burger means he can gain 4 bus tickets and vice versa. And the big idea here for the budget constraint, and you'll see it again in the production possibilities frontier, is this idea that you want to be on the outer limit, on the budget constraint. If you're beneath it, then you could have done more. You could have had more, and it's irrational to be down here. So if you're down here, then maybe you're throwing your money out the window or something like that. Does that make sense? And so if you wanted to, you could model this a different way. You could say, okay, maybe this isn't food and stuff. Maybe this is spending and saving, right? And so you don't want to spend all your money, but depending on how much money you have, how many expenses you have, maybe you save a little bit, right? Maybe you save $50 a month and you spend the remaining, or maybe you save a lot, right? But what you don't want to do is be underneath the constraint. Any point beyond the constraint is not affordable, it's not possible. And any point below the constraint, you're not maximizing your utility. You're not as well off as you could be. So far, so good? So we've got a couple of things here. We've got this idea of optimization. We've got this idea of opportunity cost, giving up, spending less to save more, giving up a burger to get 4 bus tickets. And that's going to help us throughout our economics journey. Opportunity cost is what we're talking about. When we talk about giving up 1 burger to get 4 bus tickets, that's the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is the value of the next best thing. It's the thing you could have done. So if you're sitting here watching this lecture, you could be hanging out with friends or taking a nap or watching something on Hulu. But instead you're here. And so your opportunity cost is what you would have done with your time if you weren't here with me right now. For Alfonso, in this example, the opportunity cost of a burger is 4 bus tickets. And if we flip it and we do this in economics, what's the opportunity cost of 1 bus ticket? How many burgers could Alfonso buy with 1 bus ticket? Well, a bus ticket is 50 cents. 4 bus tickets gets us 1 $2 burger. How many burgers can 50 cents buy? This is where people think economics is weird. What we would say is the opportunity cost of a bus ticket is 1/4 of a burger, right? Because you can't buy a whole burger with a bus ticket. You can only buy 1/4 of a burger. And if you had 2 bus tickets, you could buy half a burger. 3 bus tickets would be 3/4 of a burger. And then with 4 bus tickets, you could get 1 burger. So the opportunity cost goes both ways. And it's just how much you give up on one end to get the other end. Does that make sense? Let me know if you have questions. Opportunity cost is important, and it just keeps coming up. In a lot of cases, we can just think of the opportunity cost as being the price. But when we think about things like time, or things that are more difficult to value, we need to talk about the opportunity cost in terms of what the other activity would have been. So like we said earlier with school, the cost of school is paying tuition, but the opportunity cost of school is the money you could have made if you'd been working. And so a lot of times for economists, we will model opportunity cost as foregone wages, assuming that no one likes leisure and they would obviously have wanted to work. So if you spend an hour working on a class or spend an hour hanging out with friends, your opportunity cost is the money you could have made if you'd been working instead. So far, so good? Okay. So think about some of these other concepts. Think about the opportunity cost of buying a car versus leasing a car. Think about the different costs associated with different kinds of investment. If I put money in a savings account, what am I giving up? Maybe I could have gotten a higher rate of return if I'd put it in a mutual fund or in a certified deposit, a CD. Think about the cost of cooking at home versus the cost of going out to eat. This is a fun one, right? So people tell you, okay, fast food is expensive, going out to eat at a restaurant is expensive, but what about preparing food at home? If I go home, maybe I spend less money on ingredients, but I spend more of my time putting them together. So depending on how much time I have, it might not actually make sense to prepare a low-cost meal. I might not have the time for that. And the opportunity cost associated with all that cooking might be too great, and it makes more sense for me to go out and eat. Another great example is walking versus taking public transportation, right? It might be free to walk, but it takes more time than usually using public transportation. So those are the things you want to think about, these ideas of opportunity costs. And opportunity costs are everywhere. Every time you make a choice, you didn't make a different choice, right? It's kind of that multiversal thing. But for example, today I wanted to pick a beverage to drink while I was recording this video. I picked a soda. The opportunity cost of that soda was my beautiful, healthy water. And so I gave up water in favor of drinking a soda. So far, so good? Okay. The other ideas here that we've started talking about that are going to keep coming up as we study economics are the idea of marginal analysis, marginal utility, and diminishing marginal utility. So again, marginal analysis is this idea that we can look at things on a per unit perspective. So each additional dollar of spending versus savings, or each additional burger, or each additional bus ticket. And we do marginal analysis so that we can mathematize these choices as economists, just in the exact same way I did, where I said, okay, the opportunity cost of one burger is 4 bus tickets, but on the other hand, the opportunity cost of one bus ticket is 1/4 of a burger. That's that marginal analysis. That's allowing us to break things up into small pieces so that we can get incremental analysis through there. Utility is our word. It's an economics term, and it's our word for satisfaction or value. So it's going to be the value you get from consuming goods and services. But I always think that this definition could be enhanced because you get utility from lots of other things too. When we talk about labor markets, we'll talk about the utility you get from leisure time, right? There is a value to not working. If you only got utility from goods and services, there'd be no reason for weekends, because why would you give up money when you could have money to buy stuff? Well, no, we all know there's a value to not working sometimes. So utility can come from that too. More modern economics looks at the utility associated with altruism and other things that might not have been modeled by traditional economists. And then the next idea here, the law of diminishing marginal utility. We don't say law a lot in economics, so when we do, we really mean it. The law of diminishing marginal utility says that as a person receives more of a good, each additional unit is going to give them a little bit less utility on the margin. And so what we mean here, and I love this example of the first slice of pizza, it's really hard to fight this one because the reality is if you've ever really wanted something, the first one is great, but the utility does diminish on the margin over time. So if we're going to talk about slices of pizza, and let's say you're really hungry, you've been working all day, and so that first slice of pizza is going to feel awesome. Let's say it's a 10. We're so happy. What's the next slice of pizza going to be? Does the second slice of pizza ever taste as good as the first slice of pizza? Well, it's still really good. It's a 9, right? So that's going to take us up to 19. So it's still positive, but it's not as big a bang for your buck as that first one. And then the third one might give you another, let's say, 7 units of utility, take you up to 26. This is not to scale. And so on. By the time you get to your 4th, your 5th, your 6th slice of pizza, you're going to see that utility diminish. Nothing's going to hit as hard as that first pizza. It's not that the utility is going to be negative. It's that the marginal utility will decline as you consume more. So hopefully that makes sense. This idea that utility will increase as you consume more of something generally, but on the margin, it's going to increase by less as you have more and more of it. So the first day at the beach, the first drink of water, the first cup of coffee, the first vacation day, all those things are going to give us utility, and more of them is pretty much always better, but each additional one is going to be valued a little bit less on the margin so that total utility is increasing at a decreasing rate. That's that law of diminishing marginal utility. And it becomes really important because it helps us understand how consumers make decisions and how, as we get more of one thing, we might be willing to have a different ratio of exchange. So as I have more pizza, I might be more willing to give up a slice of pizza in order to get a beverage. If I only have beverages, then I'm willing to give up a cup of soda or a glass of water to get another slice of pizza. And so it's going to become important as we try to understand how consumers make choices, especially in microeconomics. It's important. So this is the next big concept in these sort of introduction chapters, is another idea that you might have experienced, but we have our own economics term for it, and it can be a little bit hard to understand. And it's this idea of sunk costs. Sunk costs are an expense that has already happened. So it's a cost from the past and you can't make it up. So think about if you were to buy concert tickets. You bought concert tickets, you spent, let's say, $100, and now you can't go. Sunk cost would be if you can't resell those tickets or anything, then what do you do with the idea of that money? The idea here is if you can't recover a sunk cost, if it truly is sunk, if there's a cost in the past that you can't get back, then you shouldn't worry about it. And that's about as zen as economists get. But what we're talking about here is when some money is already gone and it can't be recovered and there's nothing you could do about it, then you shouldn't have it be part of your calculation. The way we tend to use this in economics is with firm costs. And so the most common example is if let's say, I love the example of using the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's say we open a brand new restaurant March 1st of 2020. Not good timing, right? And we have paid rent on our restaurant. When it's all of a sudden it's March 20th and everything's shut down, what can we do? We can stop hiring workers, we can stop buying materials, stop buying ingredients, maybe we can cancel our insurance policies. You know what we can't do? We can't get back the rent we paid for that month. That would be a sunk cost. And so what economists say is you shouldn't worry about them. You have to ignore those sunk costs when you're making financial decisions. So whether I stay in business or not shouldn't consider the rent that's already paid and I can't get back. It should consider whether or not I can afford to hire workers and buy materials, because that's something that I can turn on or off. And that's where this idea of sunk costs comes from. It can be hard to think of real sunk costs, but you can think about class tuition, right? There's a point where you can get your tuition back, and then there's a point where your tuition costs become sunk and you can't get a refund anymore. And then what an economist would say is, listen, if you can't get it back, then stop worrying about it. It's a sunk cost. There's nothing you can do about it. It should no longer be considered as part of your decision-making process. Does that kind of make sense? So sunk costs can be a little tricky. Again, it tends to be used a little bit more in microeconomics. It'll come up here and there in our studies in macro. But it's just this idea that if you can't change it, you shouldn't think about it. So bring that to your daily discussions. All of this is building to one of my favorite models in economics, and that is the production possibilities frontier. The production possibilities frontier is a very simple model, and I call it a workhorse model because it's very simple, but it can be used to demonstrate a lot of different ideas. And what it is it's a model, it's a line in an XY axis space that shows productively efficient combinations of two products in an economy. So you can think about it being an individual deciding which of two goods to buy, like a budget constraint situation. You can think about it being a firm deciding which two goods to produce. For macroeconomics, we can think about it being a country choosing between producing consumer goods or military goods, or between producing educational outcomes or healthcare outcomes. And so the idea is that you have one set of resources that can be used to produce either of these two goods with different production functions, and trying to select the optimal and efficient quantity of those two goods. The slope of the production possibilities frontier is going to show you the opportunity cost, the trade-off between producing one good and another. And so I have a lot of examples of this. One of my favorite examples looks at producing computers and wheat. And as you produce more computers, you give up some wheat. How much you give up depends on how hard it is to produce either of those two goods. But that's that opportunity cost. Every time I send a worker to make wheat, I'm not making computers. And so what we'll see as we look at an example of this in the next slide is that the slope of the production possibilities frontier, or the PPF, is going to give us the opportunity cost in terms of those two goods or two products that we could be producing. So here we have a country deciding between producing education and healthcare. And if we produce all healthcare, we'll produce zero education. If we produce all education, we'll produce zero healthcare. Or we can pick a median point. So here at point B, we're producing a lot of healthcare and a little education. Here at point D, it's a little bit of healthcare and a lot of education. And so what we're seeing here is along this space between point A and point B, we see how much healthcare is given up to produce more education. So that's showing us the opportunity cost of education in terms of healthcare. Does that kind of make sense? So let me give you a little bit of a graph here. Let me make this a little bit closer. So for the PPF, we're always going to have the assumption that we're producing two goods or two products with one input. So if we've got education, maybe it's sending tax dollars towards education or tax dollars towards healthcare. And if we have, let's say we have a $10 billion budget, we can either spend $10 billion on education or $10 billion on healthcare or any combination. And a simple PPF could look something like this. And we could send a few more dollars towards education, or we could send half of our money towards education, or the majority of our money towards education, and we would see different outcomes. But the reality is, if we're not talking about dollars, if we're talking about resources, we're not going to get a straight line graph like this. We're going to get a curvilinear graph, a bowed out graph like this. And that's because there is a diminishing marginal productivity. See, economists love that idea of marginal. On the margin, as we move, if we're not talking about dollars, if instead we're talking about, say, labor hours, then as we put more and more workers towards one, we're going to have a little bit of diminished marginal utility. So think about the 10 people you know. Think about the first 10 people you can think of, and then think about whether they'd be better suited to be in healthcare or in education. If we put all of our resources towards healthcare, some of those people who you think would be better off in an educational environment teaching are going to be over here. So they're not going to be as efficient as they could be. So when we move from point A to, say, point B, what we're going to find is, as we move down that curved slope, we'll give up a very small amount of healthcare to get a lot more education, because the first people will move from healthcare to education are going to be those best suited to education, worst suited to healthcare, right? Those resources, whatever they are going to go there. And then maybe if we're in the sort of middle ground, we'll have people equally suited to both. And then we can imagine a world where we've put most of our resources towards education. So let me just kind of fix this a little bit. So now we have a point here where everyone's kind of in the middle. We have point B. Let's make this point C. And then here we have point D. At point D, we're giving very few resources to healthcare and a lot of resources to education. what's happening to the marginal productivity of workers in education is they're getting less productive. People who should be working on healthcare are working on education. And so as we increase a little bit more, let's try this. We put a little bit more resources towards education, we're going to give up a lot of healthcare to get a little bit more education, and then more healthcare to get a little bit more education, and so on. And that's that bowed out nature of the PPF. So it's showing us a bunch of different things. It's showing us the opportunity cost. So when I move from here to here, I give up this quantity of healthcare to get this quantity of education. That's an opportunity cost. But it also shows us that specialization, that trade-off, that diminishing marginal productivity. As we put more resources towards one or the other goal, each additional resource is going to be a little bit less productive. So that's one big idea that we get from the PPF. The other big idea is this idea of efficiency. So we could have, when we use marginal thinking as economists, we could consider any point along this PPF, any point along this production possibilities frontier to be efficient and possible, right? They're the maximum production points. Where we don't want to be is here. If we're there, we could have more education and more healthcare with our resources. We're not making the most that we could. We have empty factories. We have people who could be working, not working, something like that. So we're not being productive. So any point underneath the PPF is inefficient. What about being out here? That's just not possible. We don't have enough resources. We don't have enough labor. We don't have enough factories. We don't have enough equipment. We don't have enough schools and hospitals. And so the only points we can actually achieve are going to be those that are on the PPF. Those are going to be the points that we can actually, they're both possible and efficient. Let's write that in there. Anything beyond the PPF out here, this is all not possible. And anything below the PPF is not efficient. Okay, so those are the big ideas with the PPF. We have opportunity cost, we have diminishing marginal productivity, we have efficiency, productivity, and possibility. That's some of the first couple of things you can take away from the PPF. There's a lot more. We can use it to demonstrate trade, and we will in the next chapter. You'll see. It's a great model. So when we talk about these opportunity costs, like I said, we're going to see that law of diminishing returns as we put more and more resources towards one production of one good. The resources are going to get incrementally less productive. The additional benefit from putting more resources towards education means that resources that would have been better suited to healthcare are going to be used for education, and they're going to be a little bit less productive overall. That's that law of diminishing returns. It's kind of like the other side of the coin of the diminishing marginal utility, right? It's the same basic idea. And this is a really common idea in economics, the idea that as we add more and more of something to a production function, to a consumer, to any situation, it's going to tend to get a little bit less efficient. Okay? So, when we think about this PPF, like I said, the curvature of the PPF shows that as we add more resources to education, we'll first get more and more productive, and then we'll get less and less productive. And so when you see the move from A to B, you give up a little bit of healthcare to get a lot of education. But then when you move from D to F, you give up a lot of healthcare to get a teensy bit more education. And so that's showing us that law of diminishing marginal productivity, diminishing marginal returns to resources. So what are the differences? I've said they're similar. So what are the differences between a budget constraint and a PPF? First, a budget constraint is a straight line. That's because there's no diminishing returns to dollars. The slope of a budget constraint is going to be given by the relative price of goods. And so if I spend $1 more on gas, it doesn't make my consumption of gas less efficient. Each dollar buys the same amount of gas in a given setting. Yes, over time we can change prices, but it's not going to change as we buy more. And that's an assumption that we make. So a budget constraint is going to have a straight line, and a PPF is going to have this curved out line, this curved slope, or this bowed out slope. The other thing is that when we're talking about a budget constraint, it's going to be very, very clear the marginal consumption, right? We can have real numbers because we're talking about dollars and cents. So I can talk about each penny on the margin being spent on healthcare or education, whereas if I'm talking about resources, I'm talking about producing a quantity of education or a quantity of healthcare, and that's a lot more theoretical and less practical. And so we're going to expect it to be less likely to have specific numbers on the axes of a production possibilities frontier. So here's another example. Here we have a budget constraint where a consumer can buy good 1 or good 2. They have an opportunity set along this budget constraint, and that's going to be where they're going to want to consume. On the other hand, a production possibilities frontier is going to show society's trade-offs between producing one type of good and another. We're going to see those diminishing marginal returns, and we're going to expect the quantities to be more theoretical. In both cases, we have an opportunity cost. In both cases, we have not possible, possible and efficient, not efficient. But there's just going to be some trade-offs and some differences between those two models, but they're really very similar. So what do we mean when we say efficient? We're going to talk about two kinds of efficiency today. The first one is productive efficiency, and that's when it's possible to produce more of a single good without decreasing the quantity produced of another good. So when I have leftover inputs to make more output. So if I'm, let's say here, I'm not being productively efficient. This would be productive efficiency, moving from, say, point E to point D. That would be a productive efficiency. So if you're on a point inside the PPF, you're going to be productively inefficient, and you can increase your efficiency by moving to the outside of the PPF. Allocative efficiency is harder to do. Productive efficiency, easy. You're inside the PPF, move to the outside. Allocative efficiency is trickier. And I used to give this as an exam problem for my students. I would have a PPF here, and I would say, okay, let me give you 5 points. You tell me which points are efficient and which points are possible, or either, or neither, or both. And so let's just start over here. I'd say, okay, here's a society where we can either produce food, we're going to call it butter, or military expenses, we're going to call it guns, and we can apply our resources to either guns or butter. And if I say you have a point here, point A, point B, point C, point D, point E, and point F. Maybe this is point G. Which points are productively efficient? A, G, B, D. E and F are productively inefficient. C is impossible. Where students would always get mixed up was with the allocative efficiency. Sometimes they say, oh, well, A and D aren't efficient because you're doing all or the other. That depends. Allocative efficiency depends on society's desires. There are societies where they believe, hey, there's no need for military, right? There are countries that don't engage in military expenditure, and so they're doing all of their resources towards consumer goods. There are also societies that are pretty far over here on the military expenditure at the cost of consumer goods. And so any of these points is productively efficient. The allocative efficiency depends on your preferences, so it's a personal choice. So maybe I think, maybe I want to be here, you want to be here, someone else wants to be here. That depends on society's desires. And so you could think about sort of voting for the budget that you best think the country is best suited to, or voting for the politician who would select the budget you like. That's allocative efficiency. It's about finding a productively efficient point that you agree with based on societal beliefs. So does that make sense? So productive efficiency is producing as much as you can. Allocative efficiency is allocating it according to our beliefs and our desires. Okay? Kind of makes sense. It's a little tricky. That's one that, you might want to spend some time reviewing. Cool. So productive efficiency, just like I said, it's going to be points A, B, C, D, and F. The only point that's not productively efficient is R, because we could have more of everything. On the other hand, allocative efficiency would be deciding between A, B, C, or D. How much a country decides to produce depends on their production function, the cost of producing it, and the cost compared to buying it from another country, the cost of importing it. And we'll talk about this a little bit more because it's another application of this production possibilities frontier. Countries tend to have different opportunity costs in producing goods because of a lot of different things, because of differences in population, differences in climate, differences in endowments, geography, those kinds of things. Then also their technologies and the skills of their population. An example that I'll show you all, I have another example that I've used a lot, is an old textbook of mine looks at the U.S. producing wheat and computers. And the U.S. has a comparative advantage in producing wheat compared to a lot of countries because we have a ton of land and a lot of it is very good farmland. So that's going to mean that we're going to tend to be able to produce grains and other agricultural goods at a lower cost, just because of the nature of the land we happen to live on. There's two kinds of ways of looking at the efficiency of a country. The first is absolute advantage, which is just saying, hey, I can produce it the cheapest with the lowest overall cost. Comparative advantage is a little bit trickier. It's when a country can produce a good that is exchanged at a lower opportunity cost. So in my example, if I'm talking about the U.S. producing wheat, maybe I'm comparing producing wheat to producing computers. And so to know whether or not the U.S. has a comparative advantage in producing wheat, I want to look at how many computers could have been made in the time it took to produce a ton of wheat, and then compare it to other countries and see how many computers they give up when they produce wheat. And the tricky thing about that is it means you have to understand both production functions, and you have to calculate that opportunity cost. When I go from a certain level of military expenditure to a certain level of agricultural expenditure, how much am I giving up? How many, here, let's do this color. How many guns did I give up to get more butter? That's the opportunity cost. This quantity of butter, B1, cost me G2 in terms of opportunity cost. That's the idea. And so then I want to compare my country to other countries. If they want to get to B1, how much G do they have to give up? Is it less or more? If it's less, then they have the comparative advantage. And if you're having a hard time with this, let me know. I have a lot of examples of comparative advantage. It can be a really complicated concept. There's a lot of ways to solve it intuitively, mathematically, graphically. There's a lot of ways to work it out. So do let me know, because it comes up a lot when we talk about trade, especially international trade, and it's a really useful concept. It just takes some time to understand it, but I promise I have lots of resources. So if you're having issues, don't be silent about it. When we look at a production possibilities frontier, you can kind of see and intuit who's going to have the lower opportunity cost. So if I'm going to go ahead and replicate the example in the textbook up here, we're going to look at two different countries. We've got Brazil and the U.S., and they can either produce sugarcane or wheat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine those two graphs on one axis. So I have Brazil, which looks kind of like this, right? Brazil's, there we go, that's a little more like it, yeah? That's Brazil's production function. They can produce either this much wheat or this much sugarcane or any combination in between. On the other hand, the U.S. can produce either this much sugarcane or this much wheat. I'll just call that AUS, or any combination in between. Now, if we want to find out who has the lower opportunity cost, we can just look and say, okay, if I'm going to start them both off at the same point, let's have both countries be producing here. Let's just call it B1. And then I want to go down and get rid of some sugarcane. What's the opportunity cost associated with, let's say increasing. Let's say what's the opportunity cost associated with increasing sugarcane from B2 to B1? So they're going to have the same increase in sugarcane. What's going to be the difference in how much wheat they give up? So for Brazil, they're going to go from producing this much wheat, let's call it A1, to this much wheat, A2. So when they produced more sugarcane, they gave up a very small amount of wheat. So far, so good. On the other hand, if we look at the US, when they increased their sugarcane, they went from, let's say, A3 to A4. So while Brazil gave up this much wheat to get that much sugarcane, the US gave up a lot more wheat to have this much sugarcane. So who has the lower opportunity cost? Who gave up the least amount of wheat to get more sugarcane? Brazil did. Brazil has the comparative advantage in producing sugarcane because of the shape of their curve. Their opportunity cost, the quantity of wheat they gave up, is less than the quantity of wheat that the US gave up to get the same amount of sugarcane. Does that make sense? So that's one of the ways we can solve opportunity cost problems, is just by looking at the PPFs graphically. What we can see is the flatter PPF for the US implies that the opportunity cost of wheat in terms of sugarcane is lower for the US, but for Brazil, the PPF is flatter on the sugarcane side, which means they're going to have a lower opportunity cost of sugarcane in terms of wheat. So the US has a comparative advantage in wheat because of the flatness here on the wheat side, and Brazil has the comparative advantage in sugarcane because of the flatness here on the sugarcane side. Does that kind of make sense? And it's great because if you ever aren't sure, you can just kind of do the same thing and say, okay, which is going to give up the least to get the same increase? Cool? All right, let's keep moving. So now we want to talk about how we can confront objections to the economic approach. It turns out economists are not universally beloved. Some people don't like economics and they think it's problematic. So let's try to understand the different objections to the economic approach to decision making and the sort of economic way of thinking. One really common complaint is that people, firms, and society don't actually act in a way that fits economic models. And that's true. One of my favorite videos is this guy who's a stand-up economist. He's a stand-up comedian who tells econ jokes. Not a huge market for it, but that's okay. And he makes fun of the idea of marginal thinking. He says, hey, no one goes to the grocery store and says, ooh, I'll buy an orange. Ooh, I'll buy another orange. Ooh, I'll buy another orange. Ooh, I'll buy another orange. And that's true, right? You go to the store and you say, oh, I need 3 pounds of rice, not I need 1 grain of rice. I need another grain of rice, all the way up to, 3 pounds of rice. But what we do find is that even though it's not exactly the way we think, it actually is reasonable, and it does a really good job of predicting how we actually behave. And so even when we model behavior and you say, gosh, no one on the planet thinks that way, that may be true, but it's a pretty good model of how we actually move. And when we model these behaviors based on our economic rules, we find that the model gets a lot of the results right compared to the real world. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about consumer choices and other ideas. The second objection is that people shouldn't act this way. It is inappropriate for firms, society, and people to act the way economists say. Some people say, hey, It shows that people are self-interested. It says that people should only be self-interested. And yeah, that's true. But economics is not a form of morality, right? We're not trying to tell people how they should be. We're just trying to show how people tend to make decisions. And in another sense, you can always argue, hey, if altruism and being kind and not being self-interested gives you utility, then maybe that is self-interest. Also, the economics way of thinking isn't trying to describe the way people should be. It's trying to describe the way things actually happen in the real world, where we aren't always our kindest and most selfless selves. In economics, we break things down into positive statements and normative statements. And what we generally try to do in economics is make positive statements. Positive statements are statements of facts that can be proven or disproven about the way the world is. So, the sky is blue. It is hot outside. This is the figure that represents GDP. Inflation is 5%. These kinds of things are positive statements. Only when economists are being policy advisors do they tend to make normative statements about the way the world should be, because we generally try to stay out of the realm of opinion and out of the realm of subjective questions and answers. And so economists don't really talk about like, oh, well, this is what people ought to do or people should do. Instead, what we say is, look, this is the trade-off, make a choice. So that's one thing that we do, okay? When we talk about the invisible hand, and hopefully you've heard this before, the idea of the invisible hand comes from Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations. And in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith is at a market and he is observing the behavior. And he says, it is not from the generosity of the butcher, the baker, or the brewer that I expect my dinner, but from their own self-interest. What Adam Smith is saying here is that when we go to the grocery store, we don't expect to get food because the grocery store likes us or is worried about us. It's from their own self-interest that they sell us stuff. And it's from our own self-interest that we buy it. In very much the same way that when we go to work, we don't go to work and show up every day because we want to make our boss happy or we want to, be kind to our employers. We do it out of self-interest because we're going to be compensated. And so that's what Adam Smith is saying, is that with the idea of the invisible hand, he says if we all follow our own self-interest through the mechanism of price and exchange and repeated interactions, we can organize economic activity without saying, hey, everybody, this is what you should buy, this is what you should pay. Prices and markets will emerge as a sort of grassroots bottom-up behavior through that self-interested behavior. And that's what the idea of the invisible hand is saying. It says that economic activity will continue to be organized as if by an invisible hand when we follow our own self-interest. So consumers will encourage businesses to offer goods and services that meet their needs. I buy things because I like them. I just bought some very fancy-looking snickerdoodles because they looked good, and I thought they sounded like good cookies. I didn't buy it out of generosity of spirit. I bought them because they're good. If I take them home and eat them and they are good, I will go back to the store and signal to them that I appreciate their goods and I'll keep buying them. And then they'll take that signal and say, wow, people really like our cookies. We should make more of them. Maybe if they raise their prices, I stop buying them. That gives them another signal. So it's possible that broader social good can emerge from these selfish, self-interested interactions. The idea here is that self-interest in economics does not imply true selfishness. It just means that we follow our own self-interest by making choices based on our constrained optimization, based on the fact that our resources are scarce. I'm not going to go and spend my money on stuff I don't like. And so I signal through that self-interest, through that scarcity, to firms what I want them to sell more of and what I don't want them to sell more of. And then they get that information and they respond to me and my purchasing by producing what they think I might like. It's kind of like the idea of your algorithm, right? If you are on social media or on your computer, you get certain ads. When you click on an ad, it tells the algorithm, oh, this person likes that, I'm going to give them more. That's basically what we're talking about. So that is it for this chapter, which is good because my closed captions ran out over there. So yeah, that's it. That's chapter 2. That is our sense of scarcity and how we see choices and trade-offs. The big ideas there, yeah, scarcity, huge in economics. Also these ideas of these marginal relationships and the difference between a marginal relationship and a total or a summation relationship. And these ideas of sunk cost and the invisible hand are really important to economic thinking. There's a lot of terminology in this chapter, so make sure to spend some time working through your own definition of what these terms mean. They will continue to come up. We're going to be talking about scarcity and marginal relationships all semester long. But that's it. So let me know what questions you have. Take a look at your Canvas assignments, and I will see you all next time.